Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Colonel Dave Gray. I'm the Director for the Center of Leadership and Ethics, and I'd like to welcome you to VMI today. This is our 6th annual Leadership and Ethics Conference, and over the next 2 days, we're going to explore a highly relevant theme that is affecting our society today as we speak. Our theme today, ethical dilemmas in the digital age, should resound with all the issues in the news, and I'm very confident you are going to get a variety of perspectives on the ethical issues involved, and I'm positive you're going to find this an exciting and intellectually stimulating conference. So thank you for coming. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could now ask you to please stand for the posting of our national colors and the playing of our national anthem. Ladies and gentlemen, please have your seats. It is now my distinct privilege to introduce our Superintendent of Virginia Military Institute, General Benford P. III.
Well, we're off to a good start. I was afraid I was going to have to lead the national anthem there, but we'll get that started. Maybe it's just an electronic age we're in here today, everything we're talking about maybe. Well, welcome to VMI and our 6th annual Leadership and Ethics Conference. As Dave mentioned, this year's theme, Ethical Dilemmas in the Digital Age, frankly could not be timelier. Every day when you turn on the news or log on to your favorite homepage, technological breakthroughs often dominate the coverage. A plethora of new software programs, apps, or social media sites promise improved productivity, personal connectivity to the global community, and perhaps most importantly, convenience for users. I'd venture a guess that every member of this audience is carrying a miniaturized computer, a smartphone, or tablet in his or her pocket or purse, one that is more powerful than a desktop computer from even just a few years or a decade ago. Technological change, driven by the power of the microprocessor, the internet, and sophisticated digital devices of all kinds, has proceeded at a breathtaking pace. The integration and reliance on digital technology has changed our individual and national lifestyles in ways that we simply could not imagine. Last week in Tennessee, I addressed the 101st Airborne Division team that fought in the first Gulf War of 1990-1991 at a reunion celebrating very successful actions to liberate Kuwait 25 years ago. You know, at that time we had no email, rudimentary fax, and correspondence with our families was by personal letter. Wow, look at that change in just 25 years. A robotics revolution is also underway that is creating new paths to economic prosperity, providing life-altering improvements to human quality of life, and causing changes within the workforce. Moreover, the effects of instantaneous communications, 24/7 media feeds, the connection of financial markets through sophisticated software, the ability to use digital images taken by a satellite of any place on Earth have altered our understanding of national interest, national power, and strategic advantage. The digital age has allowed society to move forward farther and faster in a number of important human and social areas than at any time since, in my view, the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. The changes wrought by digital revolution have consequences that pose profound challenges, and this is the background and the environment behind the theme of this conference. As current and future leaders, we are responsible for understanding and properly using these new technologies in ethical ways consistent with our shared and our national values. Some technology-driven practices and developments, such as the use of big data to track human behavior, cyber attacks on public and private entities, the conduct of unmanned robotic warfare, and the instantaneous and powerful effect of social media to influence and direct mass public opinion, to name but a few, I think have become embedded now in our societal norms. The capabilities that new technology has given us is impressive, but only and very slowly has our society began to think deeply of the ethical implications and the moral consequences of digital age developments on our sense of privacy, individual liberty, and national security. I hope with this conference we want to pause and explore how that we can develop or use ethical practice to address new technology-driven challenges. Do our long-standing guides for ethical decisions still apply? Or do we require new guiding principles or even regulating laws for emerging technologies and their practices? More importantly, in this technological-centric world, how can we distinguish ourselves as leaders of integrity while staying ahead of the changes? The goal of the conference is to spark discussions that should question whether we are letting technology shape our character and our values, or whether our character and our values should condition how we behave using these particular advances. Over the next 2 days, you will hear a diversity of viewpoints on key topics that frame this revolution from the perspective of national security, individual privacy, and economics. The panel discussions set the stage for our Ethical Leadership Challenge exercise with the entire Corps of Cadets, which you will also have a chance to participate on day 2, during which you and other members of the audience will explore simulated real-world ethical dilemmas generated by these advancing technologies. And it will be up to you to decide which direction to set on your own moral compass. We're fortunate indeed in having with us a host of distinguished men and women whose extensive knowledge and experience in the classroom and in the field will furnish us with important insights. We're especially pleased to welcome General Retired Keith Alexander as the morning's H.B. Johnson keynote speaker. We're also pleased to welcome Dr. Phyllis Shinek, Deputy Undersecretary for Cybersecurity in the Department of Homeland Security, Christopher Sohoygan, an activist technology researcher from ACLU, and Mr. Martin Ford, founder of a Silicon Valley software development firm and New York Times and 2015 Financial Times best-selling author. Dr. Peter Singer is the author of Wired for War, among his other books, and is an internationally recognized strategist on future warfare. And he will provide the keynote address to open tomorrow's panel and the Ethical Leadership Challenge exercise. To all of our other panelists from across the United States who traveled here to participate, our heartiest welcome as well. We'd also like to recognize and thank the Virginia Foundation of the Humanities, as this conference is funded in part by a gift from them. And I thank Mr. Bruce Gottwald, VMI class of 1954, and Mr. Dick Goodall, who are major contributors supporting this conference as well as the construction of this particular facility. We hope that you will enjoy the conference, VMI and Lexington, and we look forward to stimulating discussions. And now to set the stage for this conference, please turn your attention to the screen as you watch a few images capturing current character and challenges of the digital age. And ask yourself, just because we can make technology do something, should we? Thank you.
living through a revolution, a surveillance revolution empowered by technology.
Literally within 5 to 7 minutes, we've identified the individual.
It's technology that can be put to good use to stop terrorists and solve crimes. But if information falls into the wrong hands, or it's just plain wrong, it can ruin lives.
I went without a job for months.
Tough 4 months?
Very, very difficult for me.
From implantable chips
They make a small incision in your arm.
to data mining companies,
Well, how secure is that database?
we take an unprecedented look at the powerful business of personal information.
We're not mining through the personal lives of innocent Americans.
The government is now working with big business to take surveillance and information gathering to levels that were once the stuff of science fiction.
Big Brother, if allowed to happen, will happen. And our job as responsible human beings in society is to make sure that that does not occur.
There might be no hotter topic in economics right now than the possibility that technology will soon take away jobs in a way that's never been seen before. What might be different now? What's new? Well, the answer is that there's now a concern that technology will begin to take over tasks that were once thought to be uniquely human. Tasks that don't just involve the strength to push a plow or routine movements like you'd find on an assembly line or even complicated mathematical computations that a computer can do, but rather tasks that instead include judgment, perception, and non-routine movements.
Man is on a quest to build robot warriors, real Terminators that are stronger than people, faster, able to make their own decisions. Your military has already tested prototypes. But how do we get from this to this?
The future of robots, in my mind, is to completely revamp the way we think about battle.
They should be able to pick up 200-pound weights hundreds of times and not even be able to notice it.
This series investigates how the impossible is becoming possible and what it might mean in the future.
At what point do we give the ability to make a kill decision to a machine?
Self-replicating robots could lead to the end of the human race.
Are you happy with this?
If you wanted, you could pick your own secret missions, as I do. Name it. Name it. Destabilize a multinational by manipulating stocks, but easy. Interrupt transmissions from a spy satellite over Kabul. Done. Rig an election in Uganda, all to the highest bidder.
Or a gas explosion in London.
Just point and click.
Well, everybody needs a hobby.
Madam Secretary, the Ambassador of Russia.
Elizabeth, I hope this is quick. One of my girlfriends has tickets for tonight's recital at the Kennedy Center.
Oh, don't worry. It will be. Mr. Ambassador, you have been summoned here to answer for the illegal and unconscionable cyber attack your country made on Air Force One.
Air Force One was hacked?
In a deliberate assault by your country.
I thought it was a solar flare.
Don't play games with me.
Please, Madam Secretary, I'm merely trying to...
Just listen. I have a message for your president. The United States maintains its right to retaliate when we deem it necessary. Tonight, we deem it necessary.
When is this happening?
Right now.
Hey, Mark. Eduardo, you and Eric are split up. How did you know that? It's on your blog. Yeah. Are you all right? I need you. I'm here for you. No, I need the algorithm used to rank chess players. Are you okay? We're ranking girls. You mean other students? Yeah. You think this is such a good idea?
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. The video you just watched provides a great introduction to our first panel this morning, Is Big Brother Alive and Well? Here to moderate the panel is Dr. Angela Smith of Washington and Lee University. A professor of philosophy, Dr. Smith is the Roger Mudd Professor of Ethics at Washington and Lee, where she serves as the director of the Roger Mudd Center of Ethics. She is author of several books and published articles on philosophy and ethics. And ladies and gentlemen, will you please join me in welcoming my colleague, Dr. Angela Smith.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first panel of the 2016 VMI Leadership Conference on Ethical Dilemmas in a Digital Age. I am so pleased and honored to be a part of this conference, which is examining some of the most important ethical issues that we as citizens and as a nation now face with the rise of new digital and information technologies. In this first panel, entitled, Is Big Brother Alive and Well?, we will examine the inherent tension between individual privacy and government and corporate data gathering and surveillance. Some of the questions we will address include the following. What are the checks and balances on information sharing? What are the unintended consequences of well-meaning video and data collection, such as public and private surveillance cameras and the accumulation of retail buying habits? Has the wholesale collection of data by both government and business become the norm? And if so, should it be? When should we need to give our permission to be surveilled in public or private space? What are our moral and ethical responses as citizens when we give up privacy for convenience? And are we less safe in terms of personal information and in our overall private lives? We are very fortunate to have 4 experts here today to help us sort through these difficult ethical questions. I'm going to invite them to the stage now, and then I will individually introduce each of them. They are Hasan Elahi, Margaret Hu, Jennifer Goldbeck, and Kim Zetter. So as I said, I will give a brief introduction for each of them, after which they will have a few minutes to come up here and make some remarks, and then we will all sit down together and have a panel discussion. And I will be sure to leave about 15 or 20 minutes at the end for Q&A from the audience as well. So without further ado, let me begin by introducing Dr. Hasan Elahi. Dr. Elahi is an interdisciplinary artist whose work examines issues of surveillance, citizenship, migration, transport, and borders and frontiers. One of his projects, entitled Tracking Transients, the Orwell Project, is a self-surveillance project that makes his exact location continuously available to anyone who has access to the internet. His work has been presented in numerous exhibitions at venues such as Site Santa Fe, the Georges Pompidou Center, the Sundance Film Festival, the Kassel Kulturbahnhof, the Hermitage, and the Venice Biennale. He is currently Associate Professor of Art at the University of Maryland, and from 2011 to 2014 was Director of Design, Cultures, and Creativity in the Honors College. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just 1 second, please, while we get this up and running. So hi, thank you for having me here. This is it's quite a bit to get things started off, and this is very unusual for me. So this is the first time I'm an artist. So usually artists don't end up in military schools to address them. So that's me. I should probably stand under my arrow so you can see. But it'll make a lot more sense. I'm going to talk about a couple of my projects today, but in case you want to take a look at some of the other things that I do. You can go to my website and take a look. But but when I first got the invitation here, I was excited. But then I started thinking to myself, well, what am I actually? Why am I here? I mean, I'm an artist. I mean, and this is the kind of art that I make. I take pictures of toilets, and it's like, well, why in the world would you bring me out here to do this? But this all makes sense. So why am I doing this? Why do I have like every single photo of this? It'll make a lot. So let me show you this. This is a piece that I started back in, 2002, end of 2002. Some of you may recognize that photo across the top. And then this little arrow, so we can go in a little further. You can see that there's a campus type thing. Let me pull this back up. And then we can go way out, and you can see that, here I am on the East Coast of the US and further out, and then there it is over there. And then we can come back in. You can go way, way, way in, and there's this building. And that's me as the pixel over there. So the background to this was that shortly after 9/11, I was reported as a terrorist. And basically, it was an erroneous report, Arab guy, or some Arab guy who fled, who was hoarding explosives. Never mind, I'm not Arab. Never mind, there were no explosives. But it's one of those, if you see something, say something, even if you're only just seeing it in your head. So so I got caught up in this mess and went through 6 months of my life justifying every moment of my existence to the FBI, trying to convince them, look, guys, I'm not a terrorist. And, and once you're caught up in this system, there's a certain procedure, and it takes a while. So at the end of it, after numerous polygraphs and nearly half a year later, they said, everything's fine, great. I was like, I know everything's fine. That's what I've been trying to tell you guys all along. Can I get a letter saying I'm okay? Because all we need is the next guy not to get this last memo, and here we go all over again. How do I avoid this? How do we avoid this this situation from ever starting up again. And one of the situations was, well, I mean, you can't really get a letter saying that you're not guilty of something you never did. I mean, this is, our legal system just doesn't work that way. So I said, guys, I travel a lot. What do we do? And they said, well, my FBI agent at that time said, here's some phone numbers. If you get into trouble, give us a call. We'll take care of it. So I was like, great. So before I would go anywhere, I would call my FBI agent and I would tell him, hey, this is where I'm going. This is what I'm doing. And it's like, okay, cool, not a problem. I'll pass this on to the local guys. They'll take care of it. And then a few weeks later, I'd say, I'm going, I'm going to Tokyo, Northwest Flight 7, coming into Seattle. Okay, got this. So this went on and on and on. Then the phone calls turned to emails, and really long emails, and these emails that I would tell him, hey, I'm in Cambodia this week. I'm hanging out at the beach over here. You should consider a vacation here. It's a really nice place. The food is great. The people are really friendly. They like us now. All these little details, and I would always get back, thank you, be safe. So here's I'm pouring out all my heart, like writing this, thinking I'm really making a connection with this guy, and I'm telling him all these little details, and I'm like writing him all, it's like thousands and thousands and thousands of words, and he would always write back, thank you, be safe. So it's like this really unbalanced relationship. You ever been in that situation where you think you're really telling somebody and then they're just like, yeah. Then I was like, wait a minute, wait. Why is this guy so special? Why is it that only he gets to know all these things that I'm doing? So this was back in the back in the dark ages of mobile phones, really, if you think about it. If you remember that Nokia 6600, that chunky phone that was like 3/4 of an inch thick, and you had to hit that button like 8 times just to get like one word texted out. It was, I guess they called it a smartphone back then, but it was actually not so smartphone. So I kind of hacked it in a way. I wrote some code for it, and I guess these days it would be called an app, but the word app didn't even exist in the same sense back then. And I wrote this device that would actually, I would photograph where I was, and I would upload it, and it would give, so just like this, it would show the photo of where I was with a map of how to get to where I was and what I was doing. So I would timestamp my life every few moments, and I would send it out to the public. And also my FBI agent, because he needed to know. I mean, we can rest easier where a former terrorist suspect was at all given times. So really, what I got to this point was, when I started doing this, people were like, "Why? This is crazy. Why in the world would you want to tell everybody what you're doing? Why in the world do you want to tell everybody, that where you're buying your spare ribs over there, or why are you giving them a map to get to where you are?" It's kind of funny because not even 10 years later, there's like 1 billion people doing this. I mean, think about it. Actually, so currently there are 1.5 billion active monthly users on Facebook, meaning that at least 1.5 billion people check in on a monthly basis, on a regular basis. These are real people, not fake accounts. Okay, let's do the math. What's the population of the world? Roughly 6-7 billion? So if 1.5 of those are on Facebook, that's not an insignificant number. Facebook is the largest country in the world, population-wise. Now, if you were to compare that number with the number of people that have access to electricity, access to healthcare, access to clean water, access to education, this is a pretty significant number of the world's population that's connected and doing all of these things. So another thing that also happened is when I first started doing this project, looking at yourself as a pixel was a really unusual thing. It was a new thing. You remember you'd go to the gas station, these days you can't even buy gas station maps. But you'd get that map and you'd look around and it goes, I'm here. So you'd have to locate yourself through the geography. And so now we pull out our magic phone, we hit a button, boom, we are the center of our phone. We're the center of our map. So the geography resizes around us. So we've embedded the geography into our daily lives. And your map looks very different than my map, which looks very different than your map over there. So these are the things that, a couple of things that the culture has changed drastically. Okay, why else are you looking at this? August 22nd, 6:42. That's actually at a hotel outside of Menlo Park in California. And sorry, it's getting a little sluggish with the web coming through. But you'll see a few of the images coming through, and you'll see all of these cryptic things. So what I basically decided is to tell you everything and nothing simultaneously. So what I'm basically doing here is, even though there's all this data and all this information and all of these things that are coming through back to back, in a sense, I've decided to open my life and share all of this information with everybody. And in the process of doing that, in the process of doing this project, so I borrowed one of the simplest principles of economics. Okay, the reason my FBI file has value is because very few people have access to that information. Restricted information is what creates a rarefied commodity. A restricted access to anything is what creates a rarefied economy. So if we cut out the middleman, and so during my FBI investigation, I told the FBI everything. I mean, literally, like every little detail of my life. So if I tell you everything and put it out there publicly, therefore you have the same information that the FBI has. And thus, it devalues their currency because it's a matter of, it's a supply and demand. So what's also happening here is that by doing that, by creating this system, I realize this is merely symbolic on an individual basis. But if 300 million people started doing this, and we kind of already have started doing this. If 6 billion people do this, we have to restructure our entire intelligence operations as we know it. And so it's no longer about having the information, but it's about analysis of the information. So I think this is a huge shift in understanding this. Another thing that I want to bring back here is that this idea of camouflage. You know, I know, I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of experts on camouflage on this campus, but historically camouflage was used so the enemy could not distinguish between the outline of the body of the soldier and the landscape. But you know, when you look at that combat uniform, that grayish, greenish, pixely, there's no trees anywhere that color. And I realize some of it is for urban combat, but really what it is so the enemy cannot distinguish between that, between the soldier and the noise and the night vision goggles. So there's a very distinct embodiment of the technology that's taking place. Again, these huge shifts. And so what happens when everything is archived? What happens when everything is cataloged? And what happens when every little piece of information can be retraced and exists in a quantifiable digital format? So what I'm basically proposing is that we really need to rethink of privacy in a very different manner. Historically, we had a very different definition of it. It means something very different because it's no longer about having the information. It's about analyzing, taking that information and linking it to other pieces. And we're very good at the first part. We're not as good as the second part. We're still working on it, we're learning, but it's more of a cultural shift. It's not a technological problem, it's a cultural problem of having this analysis and getting the people together to do that. So one of the things that I want to leave you off with saying is in this culture where we're actually been very good at sharing and not sharing and understanding what our boundaries are, a lot of it also has to do with presenting your own information and telling your own story and putting your own data. If the first thing that pops up on Google when someone punches your name in is something that's not necessarily the most flattering thing, you know, take Rick Santorum for example. It's not a great thing. You can't tell Google, hey, get this off. This makes me look bad. So really what happens is you need to be in control over that information. You can't delete it, you can't make it go up, but you can bury it to page 38. But in order to bury it to page 38, you need to have 37 other pages of information, and you would rather be in control over those 37 pages. So with that said, I want to leave it at that, and thank you very much, and thank you for having me here.
Next up on our panel, I'm pleased to introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Margaret Hu. Professor Hu is an assistant professor of law at Washington and Lee University. Her research interests include the intersection of immigration policy, national security, cyber surveillance, and civil rights. She has published several works on data valence and cyber surveillance, including biometric ID cyber surveillance, small data surveillance versus big data cyber surveillance, big data blacklisting, and taxonomy of the Snowden disclosures. She is currently a member of the advisory board of the Future of Privacy Forum, a nonprofit think tank in Washington, D.C. that promotes responsible data privacy policies. Previously, she served as senior policy advisor for the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and also served as Special Policy Counsel in the Office of Special Counsel for Immigration-Related Unfair Employment Practices, the Civil Rights Division, the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction and for this opportunity to speak with you today on this very, very critically important topic. And so I wanted to come back to a few phrases that were thrown out in the introduction and the opening of this conference, which is, are we experiencing a big data revolution, and are we experiencing a surveillance revolution? And what I'd like to say is that I think, yes, of course we are, but not only is it a big data revolution and a surveillance revolution, but that we are creating basically a 1984 cyber surveillance problem in that we're creating a technological revolution that is data science driven and a revolution of the information economy that's leading to then necessarily a revolution in how we do big data policymaking and how the government is informed, how the military is informed in our decision-making processes. So the three things that I'd like to talk about today is one, what is big data cyber surveillance in the post-Snowden age? Two, what is the relationship between Orwell and the Fourth Amendment? And finally, what is the search and seizure of identity that we have now in our new big data revolution in our new information economy? So I wanted to start off with a conversation we had at breakfast this morning where somebody at the table said, I thought, in a way that was very articulate and an important question. They said, I understand the right to privacy, but I also understand law enforcement's perspective that if you have nothing to hide, then don't we have very important national security interests? And I wanted to tell you about a story. When I was going to a conference on national security a few months ago, I sat next to somebody who said, I have nothing to hide. They can take all my emails, they can take all of my texts, they can listen to my phone calls. All I want is to live. That's all I want. I want to be able to see my family, I want to be able to see my children. That's the most important thing to me. So even if there's an illusion of democracy, and even if there's an illusion of privacy, I'm okay with that, so long as I can live. And I thought that this is a perfect opportunity to bring up George Orwell's 1984, especially given the title of our panel, and Winston Smith's comment in 1984, the protagonist. He said, it's not so much staying alive, it's staying human that's important. So I wanted to use that as a jumping off point to talk about what is big data cyber surveillance in the post-Snowden age. Basically, big data cyber surveillance in the post-Snowden age is a big data revolution. It is a connect the dots, a collected all philosophy of surveillance that for the algorithms to work, you simply have to have as much data as possible. And you have to hang on to it forever, because that horizontal collection of data is what allows for us to statistically predict crime and terrorism before it occurs. So it is a predictive, analytical, and algorithmic intelligence approach to information gathering. This is radical. This changes democracy, and I would say that it changes our Constitution. Our Constitution is a small data Constitution. Right now, we're dealing with big data harms, and so when you have a small data citizen versus the big data government, what does that do to our small data Constitution? And how do we flip our small data Constitution into a big data Constitution? So now that brings me to Orwell and the Fourth Amendment. So it wouldn't necessarily seem obvious that there's much of a relationship between 1984 and the Fourth Amendment, but Orwell and 1984 actually starts and ends with the Declaration of Independence. So the very opening line of 1984 says, it was a bright cold day in April and all the clocks were striking 13. Historians have said that very first line of George Orwell's 1984 is a reference to the 13 colonies and the American Revolution. Then Orwell ends 1984 with a direct quote from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. And so in a new era of big data with cyber surveillance, in our big data revolution, it's not so much this small data constitution that matters, but it really are these principles of the Declaration of Independence and what the American Revolution was fought for, why George Orwell even wrote 1984 in the first place, that seems to matter. So from, for example, 1984, we have Winston Smith explaining that when he worked in the Ministry of Records, it was his job to rectify the facts and the statistics. He manipulated the data records to vaporize individuals. And he said the data or the records were purged and vaporizations were a necessary part of the mechanics of government. Winston Smith said, "Your name was removed from the registers. Every record of everything you had ever done was wiped out. Your one-time existence was denied and then forgotten. You were abolished, annihilated, vaporized was the usual word." And so I wanted to now explain a little bit about that concept and the Fourth Amendment. So for those of you who do not know about the Fourth Amendment, this is the text. So in the Bill of Rights, the Fourth Amendment reads, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized." And so what's happening to the Fourth Amendment in light of big data cyber surveillance in the post-Snowden age? And what's happening to this text of the Bill of Rights? Well, many have said that basically the Fourth Amendment is becoming technologically obsolete. So this goes back to the small data constitution problem. Now that we're in a big data constitutional world, how can we have the Fourth Amendment adapt? Well, there's several problems with the Fourth Amendment. One is that it's anchored to a reasonable expectation of privacy. And so this goes very much to the previous speaker's point that privacy has changed. It used to be what you wanted to keep private. But now, because we share everything with all of these companies and with the world, reasonable expectations of privacy are changing. The Supreme Court has created what they call a third-party doctrine in previous generations, which said that if you shared your data with a third party, then you could no longer have a reasonable expectation for it to be private. So therefore, under that logical reasoning, all data shared with, for example, Apple, Google, et cetera, would not be intended to remain private. So this is part of the problem with the Fourth Amendment, that we simply do not have the reasonable expectations of privacy test functioning in our new modern economy. Another problem with the Fourth Amendment, for example, is what we have called the open thoroughfares doctrine. So, for example, in the U.S. v. Jones case that was heard before the Supreme Court a few years ago, the question was whether or not we could have warrantless GPS tracking, basically whether the government could put a GPS tracker on your car without a warrant. So during the course of this case, as it was being argued before the Supreme Court, 1984 was raised 6 times, not only by the Supreme Court justices, but by both of the attorneys arguing the case. The attorneys arguing on behalf of the United States and the attorneys arguing on behalf of Antoine Jones. And I wanted to read one quote during oral argument. So this was Justice Breyer. He said, "If you win this case, then there is nothing to prevent the police or the government from monitoring 24 hours a day the public movement of every citizen in the United States. And the difference between the monitoring and what happened in the past is memories are fallible, computers aren't, and no one, or at least very rarely, sends a human being to follow people 24 hours a day. Occasionally that happens, but with machines you can. So if you win," this is what Justice Breyer is saying to the government, "you suddenly produce what sounds like 1984. I understand that the opposing counsel has an interest in perhaps dramatizing that, perhaps overly, but it still sounds like it." So now we have the Supreme Court justices of the Supreme Court asking whether or not we have a 1984 problem with our current Fourth Amendment doctrine. So I know that I'm running out of time. I wanted to quickly just end with that we really truly are living in a new age where everything is becoming digitalized and everything is becoming shared. So experts say that in the year 2000, 25% of all stored information was digitalized. By the year 2012, 98% of all information was being digitalized. And by the year 2020, the amount of digital data that will be produced will exceed 40 zettabytes, which is the equivalent of 5,200 gigabytes of data for every man, woman, and child on the earth. This is going to change basically not only how we see information, but how we analyze information. And so as we drift more towards an era of predictive analytics and a pre-crime, basically, paradigm of governance, we need to ask ourselves, in light of this 1984 problem, not as government based on tyranny or totalitarianism, really a government based on big data science and a technological revolution, how do we protect the small data citizen, which was the intent of the Declaration of Independence and the idea of inalienable rights? How do we protect these core values against an increasingly big data government and a big data society? Thank you so much.
Great. So let me now introduce Dr. Jennifer Goldbeck. Dr. Goldbeck is the director of the Social Intelligence Lab and an associate professor in the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. Her research focuses on analyzing and computing with social media. This includes building models of social relationships, particularly trust, as well as user preferences and attributes, and using the results to design and build systems that improve the way people interact with information online. She is a research fellow of the Web Science Research Initiative, and in 2006, she was selected as one of IEEE Intelligence Systems' top 10 to watch, a list of their top young AI researchers. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
I was a top 10 to watch like 10 years ago, so I think they're probably done watching me. So thanks for having me here. I'm a computer scientist. I do artificial intelligence, and I build the algorithms that everybody talks about. I terrify myself with the algorithms that I build, and so basically I want to terrify you for the next 10 minutes to kind of prime us for some of the conversation that we're going to have on the panel. So, I started off studying trust, and I did my dissertation figuring out how much two strangers online might trust one another. And this led me down a path of saying, well, what other things can I find out about people by studying what they do, particularly on social media, but in general through the big data patterns that we leave behind, and we leave an awful lot of those. And that led us to first start looking at personality traits. Can I find out your personality traits? That has exploded this area of research that me and a lot of other people are working on, where we look not for the things that people explicitly say online, but for things we want to know about them that they're not saying, and build algorithms to find enough signal in those digital traces that we can discover those things. So I'm going to talk to you about a few of those projects. One of my favorite ones actually comes not from social media, but from this other data. This is from Target. Some of you may have read this story. It was in the New York Times a few years ago. The people who have read it are laughing. It starts off with this too good to be true anecdote of this dad in Minnesota calling up his local Target. He gets the manager on the phone, and he's like in a rage. You sent my 15-year-old daughter these coupons for baby bottles and diapers and cribs. She's a junior in high school. Do you want her to get pregnant? On and on. The manager has no idea what he's talking about. She did get one of these flyers, but those are sent from like Target headquarters. But the manager apologizes, and in like a great customer service move, calls the dad back a couple weeks later just to make sure everything's okay. And the dad says, I owe you an apology. It turns out my 15-year-old is pregnant, but Target found out before she told us, right? How does Target find out that a 15-year-old girl is pregnant? So it turns out Target computes a pregnancy score for all of their female customers by looking at their purchase histories, which you leave behind if you have like a loyalty card or just if you use the same credit cards when you shop there. Not only can they tell if you're pregnant, but also what your due date is. And how many of you have kids? All right, so when you had your first kid, you suddenly started buying totally different stuff than you had ever bought before, right? It's really easy to tell from purchase histories when people have kids. So you just go back 8 or 9 months and look at what they were buying then, right? That's an early sign of pregnancy. So what's your guess as to like the purchase that's most indicative of early pregnancy? Pregnancy test is the Family Feud answer, right? If we were on Family Feud, you'd win. That's the most popular answer. But it turns out that's not it. You know, I don't have any kids, but I've bought a couple pregnancy tests, right? You sometimes buy those hoping that they're negative. So what actually indicates early pregnancy? So it's actually a combination of things. Buying an extra bottle of vitamins, buying a large handbag that'll double as a diaper bag, so not an actual diaper bag, just a big bag, and brightly colored rugs. Right, so you imagine you're in Target and the lady in front of you has like a purse, a blue rug, and a bottle of vitamins, and you go, totally pregnant, right? You don't, and there's a lot of interesting things because of that, right? The combination is not logical. Like, we can kind of explain the vitamins, and you can maybe explain the purse. I have yet to hear a good explanation about the rug. But it's not a logical connection that says these things mean pregnancy. It's a statistical connection, which you can find when you're looking at millions of data records. And that means you can't know what not to buy if you want to keep your pregnancy private, because it's not the logical things that are revealing that. Another quick study looked at just your Facebook likes. So on Facebook, you can like things, you can like pages. They looked at your likes, and the interesting thing about your likes is that they're always public. You can't make those private regardless of your settings. And they tried to predict all kinds of things: personality traits, sex, gender, religion, sexual orientation, what race you were, what kinds of things you liked. And among that, they also looked at intelligence. So they had people take a standard IQ style intelligence test, and they wanted to guess from your likes how smart you were. All of this worked. In fact, they could even guess if your parents separated before you were 21 by looking at the things you liked, which was pretty interesting. And sometimes I get pushed back on when I talk about this study, because they go, like, it's not necessarily impressive computer science that you can, like, figure out that I'm a drinker by analyzing my likes, right? Because, like, if I like the Jim Beam page on Facebook, there's a good chance that I'm a drinker. But so for intelligence, they reported the likes that were most indicative of high intelligence. So I'm going to tell you what the 4 most powerful predictors of high intelligence were, and you can tell me if they're obvious. They're liking the page for science, which maybe makes sense, right? Smart people do science. Thunderstorms, the Colbert Report. They actually covered this study on the Colbert Report because of this. And curly fries. Curly fries was one of the top 4 predictors of high intelligence. So why is that the case, right? Curly fries are great, right? But they're enjoyed by people across the intelligence spectrum. So we don't know why, and that's an answer to a lot of these. We build algorithms that are sort of black boxes. We don't understand them all the time, where you dump in the data and it outputs the answer, right? So that's not very satisfying to tell people about, even though it's very exciting for us. So we look at these internal connections. We find things like curly fries. So I can give you a long description of viral spreading properties of likes and network structure and things like homophily. We're friends with people like us. But the fact is, those are guesses. We don't know. They're just statistical connections that show up in the data. They're likely to change, but the fact is those statistical connections are there. They give us a lot of power to make predictions, and they're not logical, so you can't hide from them, right? So sexual orientation, for example, not something that you have to hide so much here in the US, but there are countries where you can be arrested, maybe executed for being gay. And I say, if I ever became like a Bond-like villain, which I could do tomorrow, I could take our algorithms for predicting sexual orientation, which we're very good at, 98% accuracy, run that over all the people who live in one of these countries who have Facebook accounts, post a list. And I've suddenly ruined the lives of tens of thousands of people. And that power's there, and even if I want to keep that data private, I can't, because it's not coming from any obvious signs that a human could figure out. And the interesting thing about this is that we've done probably 5 years of research on predicting what we call individual attributes, these things that are true about us, our race, our religion, our sexual orientation, whether we're pregnant. And we're now developing these algorithms that allow us to predict your future. So my favorite study from this was done by researchers at Microsoft Research, now at Georgia Tech. And they looked at pregnant women's Twitter feeds from before their pregnancy, over the course of their pregnancy, until the day they gave birth. And they automatically analyzed, so they didn't really read the tweets, they just automatically analyzed them. And they could predict with 80% accuracy if those women would go on to develop postpartum depression by analyzing what they did before they gave birth. Now, all of these women changed the way they used Twitter from before their pregnancy, over the course of their pregnancy, which makes sense. But they changed in different ways. The women who developed postpartum depression increased the number of questions they asked. We don't know what those questions were. I'm sure people are looking at that now. But we can detect questions. Those increased for women who developed postpartum. It decreased for women who didn't develop depression. We saw, for example, the number of verbs increase for the women who developed postpartum depression and decrease otherwise. These are what we call psycholinguistic features, where the type of language you use represents your psychological state. It's a very powerful tool. We don't know any of the reasons why the types of verbs or adverbs or articles that you use reflect your psychological state, but they do. So on one hand, this is great, right? If I could go to my doctor and she could push a button and look at Twitter and say, we really need to monitor you for postpartum depression, that's powerful. It's bad if my insurance company does that, right? We just finished a project in my lab where we found alcoholics on Twitter, people who said, I'm going to my first AA meeting tonight. We ruled out all the jokes. There's a lot of jokes with batteries about that. But we took all these people, said they're going to their first AA meeting. We took all of their tweets from before, and we took all their tweets from after. By hand, we went through the tweets of about 500 people from after they went to their first AA meeting to find out if they were still sober 90 days later and a year later. Either way, but it had to be explicit. They either said they were still sober or they said they were drinking. We took all the tweets from before they went to the first AA meeting, and we did a bunch of automated analysis. We looked at social networks, we looked at the kind of text they used, the kind of words that they used, what their friends were saying, and we can now predict, this isn't even published yet, so you're the first I'm telling about this, we can predict if they will say sober at that 90-day point and that 1-year point with 95% accuracy. Almost everybody. There's 8 people that we were getting it wrong for in our data set of about 500. So this is powerful, potentially has applications, right? And it depends who you are, what those applications could be. For example, if you get pulled over for a DUI, I can run you through my sobriety predictor, right? And decide, am I going to send you to jail, or am I going to send you to alternative treatment? A lot of people who get DUIs have the option to go to AA, right? But if my predictor says you're not going to do well in AA, I can send you to jail instead, right? I don't want it to be used that way. That's not why I built it, but it could be used that way, right? And this is the thing that we have to keep in mind, that the algorithms that people like me are building are very powerful. You can't hide from these inferences because it's just statistical inferences. They're not logical ones. And there's great power that can be had from the insight that comes from those. So hopefully that's something that's going to run through the discussion that we have here. But for now, thanks very much for having me.
Okay, our final panelist today is Ms. Kim Zetter. Ms. Zetter is an award-winning investigative journalist and author who covers cybersecurity, cybercrime, cyber warfare, privacy, and civil liberties. She's been covering computer security and the hacking underground since 1999, first for PC World magazine and now for Wired, where she has been reporting since 2003 and is currently a senior staff writer. She has broken numerous stories over the years about NSA surveillance, cybercrime, and the hacker underground, and has 3 times been voted one of the top 10 security reporters in the nation by her journalism peers and security industry professionals. She's the author of Countdown to Zero Day, Stuxnet and the Launch of the World's First Digital Weapon, which recounts the sophisticated digital weapon that was launched by the US and Israel to sabotage Iran's uranium enrichment program. Rather than giving a presentation, Ms. Zetter has asked that I pose a question to her to help kick off our panel discussion. So I'm going to come over here and join the panelists, but first let's welcome Ms. Zetter to the panel. Either way, that's fine. Okay. So we've all heard a lot over the last few weeks about the FBI-Apple dispute. And so I thought maybe just to kick things off, I would ask you to say a little bit about what you see as the most important ethical issues involved in this debate, and how we should kind of think through some of these issues. What do you think the right resolution to this dispute would be? And we can let the other panelists, after you speak, jump in too.
So should I, is my mic on? Can you hear me? Should I start with just sort of giving an overview of what the issue is in terms of what this phone is and what the FBI is asking?
That'd be great.
Okay, so obviously this is a phone that was used by one of the San Bernardino shooting suspects who was killed in a shootout with police. This is a phone that's actually owned by San Bernardino County. This is not a private phone, so it is a government phone. It was issued to the suspect, and before the government gave it to him, he was a health inspector, they actually enabled a security feature on the phone. And one of those security features are that if you try and guess the password and you incorrectly guess it 10 times, the phone actually deletes data on the phone. There's also another feature that will actually delete the decryption key so that the data will still be there, but it'll be encrypted, and the government will never be able to decrypt it. So the government, San Bernardino County, thought that this was an important feature to add to the phone because he's a health inspector, and this is sensitive data in some cases that would be on the employee phones. But that's tripping up FBI now. So the FBI wants to obtain the data that's stored on the phone. They've obtained other data that got back to the iCloud. They've obtained data through subpoena requests to telephone companies, things like that. But there's data that's stored on the phone that they can't get to. And we don't even know what that data is. It may not be relevant to this investigation at all. The suspect had personal phones that were destroyed. And it seems more logical that probably the personal phones, if they did any kind of planning of this attack, was done on the personal phone and not the county-owned phone. However, the government thinks that that there may be some information there, so they want to get to it. So Apple, in 2008, with its new operating system, instituted some new security protections. And that means that Apple itself can no longer unlock this phone. They can't use a decryption key. They don't have a master key. What they did was they created a system whereby there's a unique ID on the phone that's embedded in the phone at the time of manufacturing. Apple doesn't know what this unique ID is. And in combination with the password that the user designates for that phone, those two get entangled to create a decryption and encryption key. And so only that password can unlock that data. And because the suspect in this case is dead, no one can obtain that password. So what the government wants Apple to do is to basically undermine the security features that are on that phone. They want Apple to create a new operating system that doesn't have those security features, that won't eliminate the data after 10 false tries. And there's also another protection that Apple has in there against a brute force attack. A brute force password attack involves sending hundreds of thousands of password guesses at a device until you guess the right one. And it's done with a script, an automated algorithm. But because that security mechanism would delete that data after 10 false tries, the government wants Apple to remove that from the operating system. And then they want Apple to upload that new operating system to the device so that it would run only in memory and therefore wouldn't affect the data that's stored on the device, so that the government can then run a brute force password attack against the phone. Thereby, they wouldn't be limited by 10 guess tries. And they also wouldn't be they wouldn't be restricted by 10 guess tries. And they also wouldn't be restricted by another feature that Apple has there, which is a timing mechanism. So Apple built in a protection against brute force attacks. And that protection is that every time you guess a password, the phone increases the amount of time that it responds to that. So if you have another, like 10 tries, it's going to exponentially increase the amount of time that phone is going to respond to that password guess and tell you whether it's a right or a wrong guess. And that thwarts an automated algorithm, an automatic script from making hundreds of thousands of guesses in a second. Instead, you're only going to be able to make maybe 8 to 12 guesses in a second. And so what that means is it increases the amount of time that algorithm is going to be able to guess passwords. And Apple has estimated that, so the operating system that's on this phone is the iOS 9, which was released in September 2014. That operating system, by default, asks users to set a 6-digit password, as opposed to the old 4-digit. So that 6-digit password increases the amount of power and time it's going to take to crack that password. If the user did just a 6-digit with just numbers, that would take probably, it's been estimated about two weeks possibly to crack that. If he chose a complex password of 6 digits, it's a combination of numbers, letters, characters, that could take up to 5 years to crack with an automated algorithm. So that's what the FBI is facing now. They're facing the possibility that the data would be erased after 10 false tries, and they're also facing the possibility that it would take them more than 5 years to try and crack this. So they want Apple to create this new software, install it on the system, and then let the government make an attempt to crack the password. Again, the government may never even be able to crack that password if it's a complex 6-digit password. So Apple's not being asked to unlock the phone. After it does all of this, the phone will still be locked. The FBI will have to unlock it on its own, attempt to unlock it. And the issue here is that no one has ever been asked to do this before. No company, no third-party company has ever been asked to create a third tool that they don't currently possess. And they've never been asked to sort of undermine the security of a device. Now, the government is making an argument using a law called the All Writs Act, which is a 200-year-old law. And it's designed to be sort of an assistance, an aid in helping the government get assistance for a warrant or a court order they already have. So it's not asking for new authorities. It's supposed to be simply, here's a company, we have a warrant to get data. We need some assistance from this company to help us get this data. But it's not asking generally them to do anything unusual. And the most significant case that the government is using to support its use of the All Writs Act is something called the U.S. versus New York Telephone Company. And this is a case that goes back to, I believe it's the 70s, where New York Telephone Company was asked to assist the government in getting what's called pen register data. Pen register data are all of the numbers that a phone number calls. And this was data that the phone company was already collecting as a matter of its own business for billing purposes, for fraud purposes, and things like that. And so the court decided that, yes, the telephone company should be required to give this assistance because it was already something that they were doing as a matter of course. In the case of Apple, we have something different. This is not a device that Apple owns. This is a device that the customer owns. So it's not doing something on their infrastructure already. But it's also creating something that they don't currently have. In the case of New York Telephone, they were already doing this pen register as a matter of course. The government has argued, well, Apple is already writing software as a matter of course, so this is nothing unusual. But this is not software that Apple has ever written before. And it's also going back 2 versions of their software. They'd be creating new software. So that's the arguments here. Apple is saying the All Writs Act doesn't apply here. It's asking us to do something that's not covered by the New York Telephone case. It's also asking us to do something that Congress has specifically decided not to force companies to do. And we can get into that a little more detail, but I'll stop right there.
Okay, great, thank you. Did anyone else want to comment on this case in particular? Or should I move on to some other questions? Move on? Okay, great. Thank you very much. So I have found that most students today do not seem overly concerned about issues of privacy. They seem to post lots of intimate information about themselves on social media sites, and they happily make use of apps and websites that gather extensive information about their location, buying habits, and personal preferences. Should students, and all of us, be more worried than we are about the information about ourselves that we are now making available to both corporations and the government? And maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Elahi.
Well, you know, the first thing is I don't think it's just students. And I think it's kind of unfair to say kids these days kind of thing. Because this is something that applies to all of us. And we're all interacting with this technology. And actually, you know, and in many cases, because, you know, I spend most of my life around students, there's a certain level of understanding that's much more sophisticated than many adults who had to migrate to this. So there's, you know, we talk about this thing of digital native, but we never talk about the concept of digital immigrant. And when you become an immigrant, no matter how assimilated you are still translating in your head. So there's a lot of things that all of us as digital immigrants have had to do that we're still doing this based on our analog equivalent. So I think that's the first thing. Secondly, I think, you know, in a sense, like if the only photo of it, and I mean, you see this on Facebook, like, you know, that friend that has only 5 photos, you've looked at all 5 of them. The one that has 500, after a few, you've just kind of given up. After you just kind of like, I don't really need to see any more of this. And I think in the same sense, this goes back to this thing of like, if the only thing about you is just 1 or 2, is that one photo of you passed out on the couch with your, after you've been excessively, you know, had a great night, that's probably not the best photo. But if there's thousands and thousands, it gives a much more holistic picture of who you are. And it's like, okay, that was just a human thing. So I think that our ideas of privacy and our ideas of what this is need to change with it. You know, we have this, and I really think it's a fictitious idea that of this era of where everything remained private. It never existed. I mean, you can go back to the smallest village, you know, go back 200 years or 300 years. Actually, you don't even have to do that. You can go to a small town right now. Everybody knows everybody's business. So there's an interesting parallel that's taking place here. Sure, of course, the digital tools have made those conversations and those interactions much more, you know, so it's decentralized or maybe dematerialized, the geography. So it's no longer that geographic distance. But go to any small town, everybody knows everybody's business.
If I can follow up on that, one of my pet peeves is the kids these days things, right? Because like if there was Facebook in the 60s, like the Vietnam protesters would have been all over that, right? Yeah, so I don't think it's like, oh, like the generations are so different. I think what it is an age issue, right? Like if you're in your 20s, you're doing all kinds of stupid stuff that you will know better than to do when you're in your 40s, hopefully, right? And I think that's the issue. And you know, you hit on a lot of these points. They're very sophisticated about privacy, and in fact, privacy settings tend to be much more secure for teens and college students than they are for their parents and people older than that. Like they understand it and they're concerned about their privacy. What they don't see is the potential negative implications that can follow from all of the data that they're sharing. We were talking about this over breakfast a little bit, right? So I spend a lot of time around lawyers, not just my husband who's a lawyer, but like I do expert witnessing, and this is where they vet everything they can find about you. And if they find one questionable thing, like it's coming up in deposition, it's coming up in front of the jury. You know, for those of you who have been divorced and maybe have custody suits, like if you got a good lawyer, they're not going to be like, oh, we'll forgive that picture of you, you know, doing drugs at that party 10 years ago. Like that's coming up, right? This is a hard thing to convince teenagers to think about, and there's, you know, we haven't figured out how to do that in ever. Right? Because we've been talking about this since there have been teenagers. So I think that's really the issue. It's a little more persistent for them, but I think ultimately it's not a solvable problem that young people are going to do crazy things, and we can try to warn them, and you know, that's it.
Yeah. Actually, Jen, if I could just follow up with that very quickly. The fact that our legal system uses that photo from 10 years ago, that's the problem. It's a policy problem because culturally we understand the significance of that. It's just that our policy just doesn't keep up with that.
It's not just the legal system that's using it, though. Your future employer is using
it,
and your school is using it.
So we're using a inherently flawed system about understanding human behavior. And I think that's a very significant issue, the fact that, you know, we're operating by the rules of yesterday for today.
Well,
and the cultural norms are.
No, part of this comes going to this Apple FBI case. There was a great quote in the Post that basically said, we have all of this data. The people who are deciding what we do with that data shouldn't be the companies who are going to make money off it, and it shouldn't be the government who's trying to investigate you, right? Like, we as citizens should be the ones deciding how that data is going to be used and what the policies are. But yeah, you have all of this data, whether it's being used by lawyers or admissions officers or employers, like, they're going to make money off it. I mean, most of everything you see with these algorithms is who's going to make money off it and how. And if that's how the decisions are being made, that's probably not the way we want it to happen.
How do we get control over this as citizens? So, you know, we have these data brokers now, right, who are collecting all of this information. They're selling it, often without our knowledge, without our consent, right? So is this a legislation problem that somehow we need to be given kind of the opportunity to consent? Or how do we get control of this? It seems to me like it's a little bit out of control.
Well, I'm going to defer probably to you on most of this, but I'll throw in my 2 cents to start with, which is, I think an important part of this conversation, we talk about privacy, and I thought of this after our breakfast conversation too, is that, so privacy is a psychological concept, right? So there's a legal concept and all this, but at the core, it's a psychological concept. And the psychology community, which is where I spend a lot of my time, is sort of agreed on this definition of privacy, which is you get to choose what to share, when, and with whom. That's what it is. And if that gets violated, so you've chosen to share all kinds of things. You've made that choice, and you're okay with it. I would choose, if somebody started tracking those things about me without my consent, I'd feel very violated. If I chose to do it, it'd be fine, right? So I think this is the issue. It's an issue of consent and who chooses to share what and when with whom. And we are not given the opportunity to consent to that now. So I kind of go around evangelizing that there should be some legislation about this. I don't know how to do that because I'm not a legal expert, so you can maybe talk about if that's even a good idea. But I think there needs to be much more regulation over this to give the power back to the people that the data is about and let us make those choices, rather than giving people like me as an algorithm creator the power to find out all kinds of things about you that you really don't want known or shared.
Yeah, I would definitely agree that it probably is a combination of some statutory reform and some constitutional reform, because we simply don't have an idea of privacy as it operates legally that I think is adapting to the types of new harms presented by both the corporate private sector and by the public and government uses of the new data that now is just at its disposal, and your research methods would not have been possible without the public access to this data as well.
Yeah.
So now that we have the algorithms that are able to plausibly, in the minds of the government, for example, predict crime and terrorism before it occurs, it just seems to make sense to be able to use as much data as possible in order to then use that information for informed decision-making, for drone strikes, for who to arrest, for who to target, for a terrorist investigation. The no-fly list is an example of a big data program that wouldn't have been possible before we entered the big data era. But to be able to try to predict a terrorist in order to then take action against them and then bar them from boarding a plane, for example, before it even occurs, what does that mean now constitutionally? Now that we have a pre-crime program, basically. Now that we have a pre-crime program where it's built on guilt, basically, before proving innocence. It is an inference, as you said, statistically, right? It's a statistical inference. It's a correlative evidentiary standard. That's not what our Constitution was built on. Our Constitution was built on a presumption of innocence. Well, that is a presumption that attaches to a small data citizen. Now, in a big data world, you don't have those presumptions of being able to live guilt-free. You have all sorts of inferential guilt that can follow you based on your big data. So I think unless we basically bring data brokers within more transparency and regulatory control like we did the credit reporting bureaus a generation ago. So at one point, you had the will of Congress, for example, saying that you can't just have these credit reporting agencies without some type of tighter regulation because of the impact that it has over your lives. I think probably data brokers need to fall within that type of regulatory scheme, and that we need more terms and conditions and consent requirements so that there's more notice and transparency of what is being done with your data. So I do think that there's some statutory reform that's necessary, but I do think at the heart of it, we need a constitutional reform effort. Otherwise, I think we're going to destroy a lot of what makes our Constitution the Constitution. Inalienable rights, equality principles, due process of the law. I think all of that is at risk in our national surveillance state and in our big data revolution that we're experiencing right now.
One thing about the data brokers, though, is that everything's a data broker now. I mean, it used to be that you had companies like Axiom or Experian, or you had very strictly designated data brokers, but everything is a data broker. The app on your phones, they're all data brokers. Everything that you're providing information to, you go for a blood test, they become a data broker. And all of that information gets shared and combined and aggregated, so anyone collecting data now is a data broker.
But the other thing is also, what if we just drive them out of business?
How so?
So take travel agents, for example. 20 years ago, they were everywhere. How many of them survived? I mean, now that everyone does everything online and you book your own things, the only ones that survived are the ones that have been able to change their business into a very specialized model. So if all of us put the data out there and there is no monetary value attached because it just completely dilutes the entire market, that would force a lot of these data brokers out of it. Now, I realize that's not something that we might all be ready to do right now, but this idea might catch on. It might catch on. It might be a very dangerous precedent, but I really think this, if you borrow it from a market perspective and just drive them out of business, where the data no longer has monetary value because everyone has it.
But there's money to be made through influence built on top of that data.
Yeah,
right?
so that becomes a different story. But I think the thing is, if we start off with just wiping out that first level.
But you're talking about the radical transparency, and everyone has something to hide. Everyone has something that they don't want out there.
Exactly, and it's kind of like health insurance. Everyone's going to get sick sooner or later. So it kind of all neutralizes it out across the board. So in this, you're shaking your head. Like, no, but,
what you're talking about with that kind of radical transparency is exactly the 1984 problem.
Yeah.
So even though we don't have, like I said, the type of fascism or totalitarianism, we don't have the type of tyranny that we once recognized in the small data world, but that kind of radical transparency, I think, does lead to a potential problem, as Snowden described as turnkey tyranny, that eventually with all of that data warehoused, stored forever, all of the databases at the access of a potential
which means we just
regime
need a whole
that might abuse it,
Yeah.
then I think that you have a true 1984 problem. So, but I wanted to flip your market-driven prescription on its head, and what if it became all data theft? So what if we had such a strong market interest in protecting our personal data that the misuse and abuse and capture of it became theft? And also for the government, we have what we, under the Fifth Amendment, call eminent domain, where the government has to compensate you for taking your property. And so what if we had data takings, whereas the government would have to then compensate you monetarily when they take your data? So that would be another market-driven approach.
Absolutely, yeah. I think what I'm proposing is that how do we create such a drastically different system, and not only structure but also culturally, that the current values no longer apply.
I don't think you have any takers up here on
that. I don't see ever reaching a point where data isn't valuable. And like you said, even if it's transparent data, you still have someone making some kind of profit from it, or finding some value in the data that's out there.
This is the whole plot line in the new season of House of Cards, by the way. Which my husband last night, he's like, it's too bad you can't watch House of Cards. And I'm like, yeah, I totally haven't been doing that for the last 5 hours in my hotel room. But there's a whole plot point of the two candidates in this election that's going on, where one of them is basically partnered with a Google-like search engine. And the conclusion is there's no way we can possibly win against them because they have access to all of this data about all of these people and what they're searching and what their affinities are. And that allows us to kind of micro-target in a way where we can do these manipulations to win. And so I agree with your proposal that we could put data brokers out of business if we adopt this radical transparency. But if we do that, we open ourselves up to a lot of manipulations for people to make money or gain power by leveraging the things they know about us.
Sure. So let's take House of Cards and let's apply that to, say, the current elections campaigns. And it's common practice for candidates to disclose their tax documents. Something we just, for some reason, we think it's important to know how they're getting their money. I mean, we kind of know that they've reached a certain threshold of wealth that you need to have just to even get to that level, but for some reason we have this mental thing about that. We need to know how they're spending their money and how much, what's the actual dollar value and where all that's going. So I'm actually, what I'd like to propose is that maybe instead of them disclosing their tax documents, they just disclose their phone location data and their calendars.
This candidate is doing this in House of Cards.
Okay.
Right? He's opened his phone. You can see all of his videos, read all of his emails, track his location.
So, but maybe we should get the candidates actually running to do this. And now, Kasich has already said that he's already claimed executive privilege, and that's why you can't have access to his calendar. There's none of that. Ted Cruz's campaign app, any of you have that on your phones? It actually tracks you. It looks at your movements, and it goes through your contact lists, and it sends it to his campaign.
He has dramatic analytics. He has
amazing,
thousands of data points on
and yet,
everybody.
you know, we have no idea where his locations are. I mean, I'd like to know where he's going to be hanging around, who's he meeting with next. But so this is the thing. So if we actually have that type of expectation, and this is how it can affect all of us and help us, if we have this type of level of transparency from someone with aspirations of running the highest office in this country, which oversees many of these organizations and many of these agencies, should we have a reasonable expectation of the same of them?
I think that the problem with the radical transparency model is that the big data revolution is an asymmetric power revolution. And so the theory of radical transparency as you're proposing it would work in a small data world if there was an even exchange. But there is no even exchange in the big data revolution.
That's
the
a problem.
big data revolution is all about asymmetric power. Whoever has the data has the power. And so the people who are going to build the apps or are going to build the algorithms or have the data analytics, that's where the power center is. So increasingly, as Frank Pasquale wrote in his book, The Black Box Society, power is algorithmically centered. And we need to come to grips with that. And not all of us are going to be able to be the data collection systems or be the data analytics predictors. And so whoever has it, whether it's corporate or government, that power, they're going to be able to do all sorts of things with it in a way that is not an even transaction. So I just don't think that the transparent society is going to work and allow us to continue with our natural law tradition. Our natural law tradition requires a sense of dignity, autonomy, and individuality that you can only protect, I think, if you have, as Kim was saying, something to hide, basically, if we protect these core individual values.
So, but this symmetrical, asymmetrical is really an interesting conversation because we acknowledge that. But we also think of surveillance as an asymmetrical. And it is, because when you break down the actual word, the surveillance, to the French root, it literally means to watch over. But then there's also this concept of surveillance, from watching from below, or watching the watchers. So historically, you'd have that one camera, or the big brother, whether it's a conceptual big camera over there or a physical camera that would look down. There are more cameras than people in this room right now. All of you have at least one of them in your pocket, possibly another one in a bag, and who knows how many are like lying around all over campus around here. We all have that power to point that camera back up at that other camera. So that's one example of symmetrical, asymmetrical, at least in conceptually looking at encountering surveillance. And is there a version of that in terms of data, when it's no longer about specific cameras, but about capturing information?
Does anyone else want to weigh in on this one? Okay. I have a related worry, though, and I'm wondering what you think about this. So it's been discovered that individuals who actually try to opt out of the system, right? So before we get to your ideal world of full transparency, there's going to be some people who don't want to do this, and they get targeted by the NSA or other agencies because they're concerned that they're maybe involved in something nefarious. Is that a concern that as you want to move toward this, right, if people don't share this vision, then they are going to be targeted?
You stand out.
Yeah, they'll stand out. Anyone have thoughts about that? Concerns about that?
I think you said it.
Okay. There are certain professions, for example, journalism, health professionals, lawyers, the attorney-client privilege. I think that the privacy, heightened privacy expectations that you have when you're counseling as a doctor to your patient, that there is a need for additional heightened privacy. And so I think that that can't be discounted. And if we move towards this transparent society model, how are those, like a journalist trying to protect their sources, going to fare? They're not going to fare very well. They're going to become a target just because they're going to try to encrypt their emails. They're going to try to hide their communications.
So let's take the perfect, but let's talk about like one-to-one human social interactions. There's no reason not to answer a phone call now. It's like, if you're not answering your phone, what's wrong? Why? Or you've texted someone, it's like, I know it says read at 9:34, how come you haven't written me back yet? You can't go off grid. And going off grid automatically is a signal, it's a trigger that there's something abnormal. So this happens. I mean, it happens in human relationships with each other. It's like I called you 16 times, why haven't you answered? Because I know your phone is within arm's reach from you. I mean, many of us, how many of you sleep with your phone like within arm's reach of your bed? It's one of those, we just do that. I mean, it's just something that's just become so commonplace. So that's just become an extension of our brain that just sits in this device.
Yeah, I mean, this is an issue. So I gave you guys the Target pregnancy example, which I love. And there is a story that I read last year about a couple who was also pregnant. And they wanted to keep all traces of their pregnancy off the grid, right? So they're like only buying stuff in cash, not posting anything about it. And they wanted to buy this like $500 stroller. I didn't know that there were such things, but apparently there were. And they found like the best deal for it on Amazon, right? But they weren't using any credit cards. So the husband went to, I don't know, 7-Eleven or whatever to buy Amazon gift cards with cash. And the person who was checking him out is like, we have to report this because if you buy a certain amount of gift cards with cash, you look like a terrorist. And so we report that, which is interesting. So it's exactly what you were saying, right? You try to go off the grid and you start looking intensely suspicious. But this brought to mind one other thing, which I'd be interested in your comments on, because I was reading a story just maybe a month ago about this student, elementary school student who his school had tried to kick him out because he had a set of genetic tests, like he was born with some problems, so they did a full kind of 23andMe style profile that said he was at risk for developing, I think, cystic fibrosis. He didn't actually have cystic fibrosis, had no symptoms of it, didn't have it. But there were two other students that were siblings in the school who did have it. And apparently, I think I'm remembering the condition right, if you have cystic fibrosis, you're at extremely elevated risk for developing certain kinds of infections. So you can't, these two were siblings that were already there, but you can't have two students with cystic fibrosis in the same school. So because this kid had a genetic test that said he was at risk for it, they wanted to kick him out, even though he didn't actually have it. It was poor understanding of the genetics and the science by the people at the school, right? They're not medical professionals, they don't know what it means, but they made this life-changing decision, that they had to go to court and had to fight it, and I think he was ultimately allowed to stay in the school. But I think this is a problem that comes with some of this radical transparency, is that the data's all out there, but there's a lot of stupid people, intentionally stupid and not, who are gonna interpret that data in damaging ways that can really affect our lives. And that story to me, when I read it, was a sign of this very dystopian view I have about where we're going, that as this data gets out there, and schools may reasonably request your medical records, they're suddenly making decisions that they're completely unqualified to make, but that have real impacts.
Yeah, and I think that's the issue, is that who's actually making that decision. So, you've seen some of the food that I eat in all these photos, because I send that, I post that online. It's like, so you can see that, look, I couldn't have been involved in that terrorist attack in Afghanistan because I was busy eating this meal at this time, and I went to this gas station, so there's this track, there's this like 24/7 alibi. And we all have this, whether we're aware of it or not. Our phones have complete detailed tracks of every little thing you've done, even like down to footsteps now. If you look at your health app, it'll have all that in there. If you look at your phone frequent locations, which is actually freakish, especially if you don't know it's even on, take a look at it sometime.
It's on if you haven't turned it off.
Yeah, if you haven't turned it off, it's on, and it's going to really freak you out. But anyway, so going back to this thing, I'm okay with the FBI looking at what I just had for lunch or something, but I'm much more worried about my health insurance company looking at my food and looking at my grocery buying habits and go, you eat like crap, we're dropping you from our insurance plan. And could that happen? Could we be in a society where that happens? Or just that, or the other option of that, the flip side of it is, or just like everybody eats like crap, so everyone's at risk at some point. So what are we looking at in that sense? So I think this really, it goes back to this thing of who's actually making that decision and what value system are we using to make that decision? What are we basing that decision on, and whose value systems? Great. So, and I'm calling for a change in value systems of this.
Okay, great. We have about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we give an opportunity for the audience to ask questions that they might have. Are there any questions out there? Yes, right here.
You know, we have some participants here that are from K-12 public education institutions. And in our line of work, digital citizenship is one of those buzzwords that we hear about a lot at our school, especially the high school level. So my question for you is, where do you feel the responsibility lies for digital citizenship education? Because in my opinion, and it sounds like you agree, the vast majority of people have absolutely no idea the extent and level that their personal information is being used beyond what they obviously divulge. So where does that education, or the responsibility for that education, where does that lie?
I think it's a great question, and I think that you know, not to dump more things on schools and teachers, but I think you're absolutely right. I think that's the direction that you're going, is that you're implying that the government, the schools do have a responsibility. We teach kids hygiene in schools. We teach them how to use a telephone, or we used to teach them how to use a telephone. You don't need to anymore. But we teach them all different kinds of things. We teach them safety, about not getting into a car with strangers. Your parents are expected to teach you that as well, but we can't expect that anymore. And I think that, yes, I think that you're absolutely right, that sort of digital hygiene and digital health is something that schools should probably take on.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think there's challenges, right? So I talk to a lot of school students. I'll give you one tip since you're working with this, or for those of you who are. My favorite tool for using with students is this video called Take This Lollipop, which is like the best thing on the internet. It's like this 2-minute interactive horror movie where you click sign in with Facebook, and it's got this like creepy stalker dude who like looks through all of your stuff, and it can get all of your stuff. It's astonishing, and I use it as this example where I thought it couldn't pull any of my data, and it got everything: status updates, photos, friends lists. It's very visceral and is very impactful for students from about 7th or 8th grade on. Kids younger than that don't get it. They can't separate the fantasy of like, how'd that guy get to your house from the video. But once they're older than that, it makes an impact of here's what could happen with people who get access to that data, right? But on the larger question, yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think this is something that has to happen in schools. And we see it in all sorts of other places where, like, if schools don't teach, like, sex ed, you see all kinds of more problems with those students, right? That they're getting more STDs and they're getting pregnant more because they're not taught it. I think this is a similar kind of safety issue, that schools that don't do it are kind of putting their students at a disadvantage in a world where they can be taken advantage of and see those sorts of negative impacts.
I should point out, though, that when you do that, that digital education, quite often the schools are violating the privacy of the students themselves through the digital use. We had a case out here in Pennsylvania where students were given laptops, and those laptops were being activated. The webcams on the laptops were getting activated at home, catching students in their bedrooms, undressing and sleeping and things like that. Also had cases with a lot of sexting, which has become a problem in schools, where schools are seizing these phones and doing an illegal Fourth Amendment search on students. So I think that the schools themselves need to educate themselves, first of all, in order to understand what the laws are around digital protections that the students themselves have, and also educate the students about those laws as well. So not just protecting your data and how you should sort of preserve your privacy, but also what are your rights and where that border is with the school.
Other questions? Yes, right over here. Yep.
You talked about opting out and becoming a target. Has someone, or I'm sure someone has, tried to confound and misinform the data collectors by putting out a phony line?
Yeah, we were talking about that. We were talking about that, polluting the data. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if enough people did that, where's the real data?
Yeah, so I'll let all these guys talk about polluting the data, but the answer actually is no, there's nothing you can do about it. You can try, but so for example, in this alcoholism study that we just finished, by far the biggest signal that we used is this psycholinguistic text analysis. So this is inferring your psychological state from the text that you use. And we don't actually look at the stuff you say when we do that analysis. We look at the structure of the words that you use. So first person versus third person pronouns. Do you say I more, or do you say he or she more? How many, what's the proportion of adverbs to verbs that you use? These things that are unconscious about your choice of language are actually the strongest clues that we have now in a lot of these predictions that we make in the algorithms. And they're not something that you can consciously change. So the ability to do that kind of hiding, there's all kinds of stuff you can do, and we have great examples we talked about over breakfast. But really, like if I want to find something out about you, I can find these clues in all sorts of other ways. In fact, if you stay offline, I can still find these things out about you by looking at your friends and finding patterns there, because the signal is often strong enough from that. So there's plenty of places, no matter what you do, that are going to give me a strong enough signal that you can't consciously corrupt, where my algorithms are going to work just fine. But we can talk about the fun data corruption
This
thing.
is why you're scary.
I'm terrified.
Because the thing is, like, all the things that we come up with, all of these tactics that we come up with, they're just temporary fixes. This is just duct tape. These are not permanent solutions. These are not permanent in any way. And I think that's a major thing for us to acknowledge, that these algorithms are getting more and more and more sophisticated. The people running them, they're getting smarter and smarter and smarter. The machines are getting much more sophisticated on a daily basis. So all of this is basically going to lead to a point where everything is archived and everything is indexable and everything is tracked and everything is or everything can be analyzed. And that's the scary part. So one of the things, I think in a way, for right now on a societal level, I think opting in is that ultimate form of power, when you intentionally opt in rather than opting out, because the opting out causes all these triggers to go off. But a couple of things in terms of data pollution, we talked about this morning. There was an example in the UK where all these folks would get together, those grocery store discount cards?
That Target uses.
Yeah, or just anybody. And they would just basically swap with each other, like every month or every couple of months. So 1 week or 1 month you're buying a lot of cat food, and then you're not buying cat food for the next 8 months. It's like, and then you start buying cat food again. And then 3 months later you start buying cat food again. It's like, what's going on? I mean, what happened to this person's cat?
You killed the cat.
I mean, does this person keep getting a new cat every 3 months and it dies? Or we don't know. So it's all of those types of things. So there are ways of corrupting the system, I think temporarily, but I think as a long-term, she's just going to outsmart us.
I will. I think that there's something else that's really important to realize, is that algorithmic intelligence is really more about a virtual reality understanding of knowledge and existence than it is about real knowledge and real existence. So what some people have said about big data analytics is that it creates more of a hologram. And as we move more into this pre-crime or pre-terrorism paradigm, it's digital avatars that are going to be targeted. So the hologram based on your digital trail that's going to allow for inferences of guilt or suspicion, that is going to become the concern. Not so much whether or not you are really a terrorist or really a criminal, but because of the digital trail creating that virtual reality that allows for decision makers to think that they have a statistical probability that you are a terrorist or are a criminal. That's going to be the basis of concern. And we really don't have a statutory or constitutional framework for protecting our digital avatars. That our digital avatars will be us, and we as people will suffer the consequences. But really, it's our digital avatars that are going to be targeted.
I just want to, so I forget who said at the beginning that, maybe it was you, that people are fallible, but algorithms aren't. Algorithms are fallible.
Oh, I wouldn't say that.
Okay,
Algorithms
so
fail all the time.
someone made some statement. And these algorithms are not open sourced. So, when you're making conclusions about things like this, and the people whose lives are at stake or their livelihood is at stake in some manner based on an algorithm, but you don't know what went into that algorithm, the algorithm itself can be making false conclusions.
So I spend a ton of my time going around talking to corporate audiences about this kind of thing, the sorts of algorithms I talk to you about. And so those algorithms, right, all the ones I talked about when I was standing up there, are the same as the Netflix algorithms that recommend shows that you should watch, or the Amazon algorithms that recommend stuff you should buy. I mean, the underlying algorithms are identical. And we know how to handle the Netflix and Amazon recommendations, right? You don't go through and just watch in order every show that Netflix recommends. You don't buy, I'm going to buy the first product that Amazon recommended, and then the second, and then the third, right? You don't do it that way. You say, this is interesting, and maybe I'll investigate this, but you treat it as one data point in the space of human
You usually
decision.
say, how the hell do they think that I would like that?
Yeah, well, this is the
from
thing, right?
everything that I watch.
Like these algorithms, overall, they're wrong about 20% of the time. And then it's like, why would you think that, right? Most of the time, they're right and totally not insightful, right? So you like buy the latest Stephen King novel, and it's like, here's 12 more Stephen King novels. And you're like, thanks, algorithm, I never would have figured that out, right? And then like a small percentage of the time, and this is the thing we want to really do, is it comes up with like the best recommendation that you never would have thought of ever. Right? My favorite example of this is I bought the Zombie Survival Guide, which is exactly what the title sounds like. And I got it, and I read it, and I go back the next day, and it's like, you might want, you know, the author's other books, a couple of these zombie movies, and then this like 15-inch camping axe with a knife that pulls out of the blade. And I was like, oh my God, like that's exactly what I need, right? This book was all like close-in zombie contact. And then I was like, all right, I don't need it. But I bought it anyway. It's in my kit at home. Because it's just like the best recommendation I ever got, right? And you know, you get these like on Pandora and Netflix, like, oh, I never would have thought, I never even heard of this movie, but it's so good. That's great, right? That's what we want from the algorithms. We seize on that. But yeah, they're wrong a ton of the time. And we know how to handle them in this recommender systems context, right? That's how we're going to have to treat them in the pre-crime context and all these other spaces. But it's hard to convince people of that because algorithms feel like the oracle of truth when they're really like a kind of okay colleague who you need to second guess.
I mean, it's fine when it's something like, would you want to buy this DVD or this book?
Yeah.
Is it okay for the no-fly list? Is it okay for the kill list?
Yeah.
So I think we need to ask ourselves, are we okay with depending on algorithms in a big data type of governance system for affecting our core constitutional rights?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's exactly, I mean, you know, if they recommend a bad movie, okay, so I just watched a bad movie. It's not that a drone missile comes and hits my house.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, so there is a certain level of seriousness and a certain level of reality that if we're applying the same value to that system.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue as an algorithm creator, we
Yeah.
should never depend on algorithms for anything. That they should just be one point in the context, in the world of things that we make a decision based on. And if all you have is the algorithm, you need to just put that away, right? Because none of them are reliable enough that they should be the only thing that we're basing important decisions on.
I think we have time for one more quick question right over here. Mm-hmm.
You can probably speak to that better, but when someone raised the issue of sort of regulating data miners, data brokers, we already have some regulation, particularly with regard to the credit reporting agencies. So if someone uses data in your credit report as to come up with an adverse conclusion about you for work purposes, they're supposed to notify you that they use data from your credit reporting, from a credit reporting agency in order to make some assessment about your viability for a job. But we know that they don't. We know that they don't have to tell anyone that they use that data. Or they can say that that wasn't part of the reason that they didn't give you the job. There were other candidates. So the regulation part isn't black and white, and it's not necessarily enforceable. And it feels good on paper, but in reality, there are many ways to just ignore the regulation.
I think that's why you see a lot of these companies trying to champion self-regulation. And I don't know whether or not that would be more viable or enforceable if there was more of an industry internal regulatory system. But I think that there's a lot of people who share that concern.
Let me chip in one more complexity. I'll be quick on this, which is we have other regulations that are challenged now in this space. For example, we have non-discrimination regulations in housing and hiring. And there's just a case recently that settled against Wells Fargo, who had an algorithm to help determine if you should get a mortgage. You're not allowed to discriminate based on race, and race was not a factor that they considered, but they put in zip code, which maps pretty much directly to race, right? And so they were finding Hispanics were getting much worse terms on their mortgages consistently from Wells Fargo because the zip code would identify Hispanic neighborhoods. And Wells Fargo was not intentionally trying to do this, but because the algorithm considered zip code, the algorithm said basically Hispanics should get worse terms. And Wells Fargo had to settle this for violating housing discrimination. And that's a problem in a lot of algorithms, that the algorithms don't know anything, and they will discriminate in ways that we very explicitly don't want to, including legally. And it's hard to enforce those regulations. You have to do a ton of digging to say, oh, this is kind of what happened with this algorithm. So, I mean, I do believe that there has to be some regulation in this space, but I think because we're just trying to figure out what these algorithms are doing, it's going to be really challenging to do it comprehensively and effectively.
And similarly, the media reports of the banks that use your Facebook friends and calculate wealth based on the network of your Facebook friends and whether or not that has discriminatory impact and the types of loans or mortgages that you receive. I think that those are going to be some really big issues moving forward.
Great. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.
You've done an outstanding job of framing out the first panel here for the session, and I drew a couple things, trying to figure out the difference between correlation and causation with these algorithms, and certainly you have underscored the tension between individual liberty and tyranny on this side, and there are some great tensions there that we're going to explore through the next 2 days. So on behalf of the superintendent, the staff and faculty, and the Corps of Cadets at VMI, I'd like to thank you for coming today to inform us, educate us, and to get us to think about these very issues. So I'd like a small gift on behalf of the superintendent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's give them one more round of applause.